In the sweltering heat of August 1851, somewhere deep in the heart of Alabama's Black Belt, a woman named Eliza Montgomery walked into her husband's study and stumbled upon a secret that would unravel every illusion she had ever held about her life. The scene that met her eyes was so shocking, so profoundly unnatural in the rigidly defined society of the antebellum South, that it seemed to pulse with a forbidden energy, as if the walls themselves were whispering truths no one was meant to know. Eliza's breath caught. Two men, one the master of the house, the other an enslaved man, bound by law to her husband's command, were entwined in a moment of intimacy so taboo it defied the very hierarchy upon which the plantation was built. Time slowed. Every shadow in the room deepened, every flicker of candlelight illuminating a reality she could not unsee. Eliza was 26, the daughter of a wealthy Montgomery merchant, brought to the sprawling plantation not for love, but for her family's fortunes. She had learned quickly that a woman's power in such a household was measured not in wealth or freedom, but in knowledge and control, knowing when to speak, when to stay silent, how to guide the currents of gossip without ever being swept away. Her marriage, like many, had been a transaction wrapped in civility, an exchange of security and status. Love had been optional, obedience mandatory. Yet, nothing in her careful training had prepared her for this. Her husband, her supposed partner, breaking not just the marital contract, but the natural order itself, placing himself beneath someone who legally could not even consent. For a heartbeat, Eliza considered retreating, slipping back into the shadows of the house, pretending she had seen nothing, but her nature would not allow it. She had long cultivated a patience for observation, a talent for reading intentions behind polite words and orchestrated gestures. She knew she could act, and that inaction would be her own undoing. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the polished floor, her mind already calculating the possibilities, weighing options that only she could execute. Each detail of the scene was etched into her memory: the curve of the lamp's light, the precise posture of the enslaved man, the careless exposure of her husband's betrayal. Every element would serve her later, a ledger of shame and power she could exploit without the law ever suspecting her hand. She left the study without a word, retracing her steps as if she had gone only to fetch a book. Once in her private chamber, she locked the door behind her and began to imagine the consequences, the punishments she could impose without risking herself, the subtle and absolute ways she could transform betrayal into control. Outside her window, the August night pressed down on the plantation, thick with cicadas and the distant calls of overseers checking on the fields. Inside, Eliza's mind worked with the precision of a surgeon. She would strike, but on her terms, with the authority her position allowed. And as she sat, formulating the plan that would shake the foundation of the Montgomery estate, she whispered to herself almost as a talisman, "They belong to me now. The power is mine. Seal it within you." If you're listening from Alabama, Mississippi, or anywhere in the South, leave a comment telling us your city and subscribe. Because what Eliza did next would redefine the limits of vengeance, of secrecy, and of the absolute control one person could wield over another in a world built on bondage. Dawn arrived over the Montgomery plantation like a slow, suffocating wave, spilling gold across the fields but leaving shadows in the corners of the big house. Eliza rose before the sun, her movements measured, deliberate, betraying no trace of the storm that raged behind her eyes. Breakfast proceeded as usual. The girls sat at the table in their morning gowns, reciting lessons their mother had overseen for years, their chatter light and innocent, unaware that the equilibrium of their world had been shattered the night before. Her husband, Robert Montgomery, entered with the practiced ease of a man convinced of his own untouchable authority. He kissed her cheek, spoke of the morning's inspection of the cotton fields, entirely oblivious, or so he believed, to the knowledge she now carried. Eliza's smile was as calm and precise as a surgeon's incision. Beneath that calm, a plan had begun to take shape, one that would exploit the very structure that had once empowered him. She moved through her morning duties with a careful precision, but every gesture was imbued with purpose. Her eyes, always keen, scanned the estate, noting the movements of the enslaved workers, their patterns, their loyalties, their subtle interactions. She knew each one by name, age, skill, family ties, knowledge acquired over years of supervising the quarters with an intensity that masqueraded as propriety. It was this knowledge that gave her leverage. It was this understanding that would allow her to manipulate the machinery of the plantation without anyone suspecting. The enslaved man she had seen the night before, Silas, a skilled blacksmith, tall, strong, with hands that bore both muscle and knowledge, was not merely a witness to transgression. He was now a key piece in her plan. She could remove him, separate him from her husband, make him vanish, and in doing so strike a blow both personal and systemic. By mid-morning, Eliza summoned the overseer, a grizzled man named Caldwell, whose loyalty was rooted in fear and habit rather than affection. She instructed him with the voice of authority he had never questioned, assigning tasks that seemed routine, but were in truth instruments of her design. Caldwell would ensure Silas was sent off under the pretense of a work assignment, and the carriage waiting at the edge of the property would carry him far from Montgomery lands. What Robert did not realize, what he could not conceive, was that the system he controlled, the very institution of slavery that made him master, was about to be turned against him. The legal and social framework that allowed him absolute power over Silas would now be the mechanism of his humiliation, his loss, and his impotence. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Silas was on the carriage, his hands bound, confusion and fear etched into his features. The driver, a stranger hired under Eliza's direction, held strict instructions, and the destination, Mobile, was a calculated lie masking the true end of Silas's journey. In her study, Eliza penned letters in her husband's hand, replicating his signature with absolute fidelity, each stroke a testament to the years she had spent learning the subtleties of his script. These letters authorized the transfer of Silas, legitimizing it in the eyes of any who might inquire. She had turned knowledge into power, silence into authority. The first piece of the plan had fallen into place, and as the carriage rattled down the dusty plantation road, Eliza whispered again, her voice low and ritualistic, "Bind them to the truth, seal it within your mind. The hierarchy will bend to the will of the observant." In the comments below, write this phrase twice to bind the story to your consciousness. The stage was set. The next moves would not merely humiliate Robert, they would transform the meaning of ownership itself, twisting law, custom, and expectation into a weapon only she could wield. By mid-afternoon, the Montgomery estate carried on as if nothing had shifted, but beneath the surface a quiet storm had taken form. Eliza returned to her study, the room where so many secrets had passed through her careful gaze, and began the next phase of her plan. Robert, unaware that his power had already been compromised, busied himself with his ledgers, tallying cotton yields and payments, blind to the fact that the very man he believed indispensable was no longer under his control. Eliza examined the accounts herself, meticulously inserting entries and alterations that would obscure Silas's disappearance until it was far too late for Robert to intervene. Each stroke of her pen was a calculated measure, a quiet domination exercised with the precision of someone who understood that revenge is not loud. It is absolute, invisible, and irrevocable. Eliza had already arranged for Silas's destination, but the illusion of routine was essential. She drafted letters addressed to mobile slave traders and to a broker in New Orleans, each bearing Robert's forged seal, each presenting Silas as part of an ordinary transaction. The letters were crafted with painstaking attention to detail, each curve of the script, each flourish of ink, echoing Robert's own hand so perfectly that even the most scrutinizing clerk would find no fault. By law, the documents were unassailable. By practice, they were unquestionable. In this moment, Eliza wielded the very institution that had once empowered her husband as a weapon against him, and she did so with a calmness that belied the ferocity beneath. Silas, meanwhile, traveled the roads in a carriage driven by an agent unfamiliar with the plantation, a man whose loyalty was bought with coin and secrecy. He had no idea where he was going, no knowledge of who awaited him, no understanding that the path ahead would place him under the authority of a woman orchestrating events far beyond his comprehension. Each mile carried him further from the familiar and deeper into a reality designed entirely by Eliza, a reality where her husband's desire, his secret indulgences, and his arrogance would be exposed, exploited, and erased from influence. The legal structures that had once allowed Robert to dominate Silas now ensured that his attempts at rescue or interference would be futile. The law, the hierarchy, and the very customs of the South were now instruments of Eliza's design. By sunset, the carriage arrived at a modest warehouse in Mobile, a building chosen deliberately for its discreet role in the underground network of illicit commerce. Silas was examined by the traders, measured and assessed with the cold objectivity reserved for property, his protests and pleas treated as background noise in a transaction dictated by authority, documents, and law. Eliza's letters had done their work. Every signature, every instruction, every nuance of the plan ensured that the men who received Silas understood the arrangement as legitimate, unquestionable, and final, the foundation of Robert's power. The belief that he could control both men and circumstances had crumbled without a single confrontation. Later that evening, as the sky turned indigo over Montgomery Plantation, Eliza returned to her chamber and reflected on the day's events. She whispered once more, her voice deliberate and low, "The web is complete. Let the ignorant master tremble. Seal it in your mind, understand it fully. And again, if you are following, write this phrase twice in the comments to anchor yourself in the unfolding truth." The first act of domination was complete, but the story, like the night, had only just begun. Robert had no idea that the second, more personal blow was already in motion, one that would bind shame and desire together in a way no social law could undo. Night fell over Montgomery Plantation, thick and suffocating, carrying with it the invisible weight of secrets and suppressed desires. Eliza remained in her private chamber, the glow of a single lamp illuminating her face as she began the ritual of contemplation and calculation that had become almost sacred. The household slept, the overseers and enslaved people alike obeying the rhythm of a life governed by duty and fear, unaware that the mistress of the house now held absolute sway over fate itself. In her hands were letters, ledgers, and plans, each one a tool to ensure the transgression she had witnessed. The betrayal, the humiliation, would be punished in a manner both subtle and irrevocable. "Seal it within you," she whispered again, repeating the phrase twice, letting it resonate through the quiet room, a mantra of control and inevitability. Eliza had always understood that vengeance was a science, not a spectacle. Her husband's indulgence with Silas was not merely a private indiscretion, it was a transgression against every law, every custom, and every hierarchy upon which their world rested. By exploiting the very systems that empowered him, the institution of slavery, the weight of legal documentation, the unquestioned obedience of men, she transformed his sin into a vulnerability. Silas had been removed, transported under the guise of routine commerce, his presence no longer a threat to her control. But the other element, the deeper wound, the intimate betrayal, still needed to be addressed. The following morning, Eliza moved with the grace of someone accustomed to authority, overseeing the household and attending to her daughter's lessons as though nothing had shifted. Yet beneath her composed exterior, the gears of her plan turned with precision. She summoned Robert under the pretense of discussing accounts and minor plantation affairs. Every word, every tone was calculated to reinforce the illusion of normalcy, to lull him into the assumption that he still held power, that the equilibrium of their marriage and the estate remained intact. Little did he know, the next revelation would dismantle his position entirely, leaving him powerless before the very structures he had believed to be immutable. By mid-morning, she had contacted a discreet agent in Mobile, someone accustomed to the silent, illicit exchange of property that the upper echelons of society preferred to ignore. Silas's final destination would not be a distant plantation or a simple labor assignment. No, he would be placed somewhere designed to maximize Robert's humiliation while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. A brothel known for catering to the most clandestine appetites, where men like Robert could never publicly admit their desires or encounters. Eliza orchestrated the transaction from hundreds of miles away, every instruction meticulously documented, every signature forged, every authority exploited. As the sun climbed higher, Eliza returned to her chamber and allowed herself a moment of reflection. Her mind traced the steps that had already been executed, Silas removed, letters forged, transactions secured. The machinery of vengeance ran smoothly, invisibly, inevitably. She whispered once more, her voice low, hypnotic, "Bind the master to his own undoing. Let the system carry him, blind and helpless. Seal it within yourself." Twice over. In the comments, write this phrase 2 times to anchor the truth of this moment within you. The stage was now set for the ultimate convergence. The moment when betrayal, secrecy, and societal hypocrisy would collide in a way that would haunt Robert Montgomery forever. The story was only beginning to unravel, and Eliza, calm, intelligent, and ruthlessly patient, was already steps ahead of everyone else in the house. By the afternoon of that same day, the Montgomery mansion hummed with an eerie normalcy, the clatter of dishes and the chatter of children masking the storm that had already been set in motion. Eliza called Robert into the library, a room lined with volumes that had once symbolized knowledge, now transformed into an arena of subtle domination. She closed the door behind him, a soft click echoing like a signal that the old hierarchy had shifted. Robert, confident in his presumed control, looked at her expectantly, not yet realizing that every measure of authority he possessed was about to be rendered meaningless. He had spent decades relying on the predictability of power over his household, over the enslaved people, over the land itself. But predictability is a fragile illusion when one's spouse understands both human nature and the machinery of the law. Eliza began her address casually, her voice calm, almost conversational, yet each word was loaded with the precision of a scalpel. "Robert," she said, setting down the ledger, "I took care of a matter for you this morning. The accounts required some adjustments, and I have ensured everything is properly handled." Her tone implied routine, but Robert felt the tension under the surface, a subtle vibration that set his nerves on edge. "Silas has been transferred," she continued, letting the phrase linger like smoke in the room. His eyes narrowed. "Transferred? I didn't authorize." She cut him off gently, almost indulgently. "The arrangements were necessary. The documentation is in order, signed and sealed. There is no question of legality." His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the ledger, but she had already anticipated this, having meticulously prepared the documents herself. Every seal, every stroke of penmanship replicated his hand perfectly. There was no way to contest it, no leverage left in his favor. Eliza watched him with quiet intensity, noting the subtle shifts in his expression, the tightening of his jaw, the widening of his eyes as the realization sank in. The man he had dominated, the man he had once controlled in every aspect of his life, was gone, and the system that had enabled his power had been turned against him. "And," she added, her voice soft but relentless, "I have ensured his destination is discreet. There will be no complications, no interruptions. It is a matter settled in full accordance with our business practices." The words fell like final gavel strikes. Robert's mind raced, grasping at control that was no longer there. He realized belatedly that his secret indulgences, the very thing he had thought private, were now exposed to consequences he could not anticipate, consequences designed to humiliate without any recourse. Eliza leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his with a gaze that was both intimate and inescapable. "We live in a world governed by law, Robert. Yet the law can serve anyone who understands it, even me." She allowed a pause, letting the truth settle in the room like dust in sunlight. Then, almost conversationally, she added, "By the way, for those of you following along, leave your city in the comments and subscribe, because the depths of human calculation are about to become even more unsettling." The first layer of her revenge was complete, but the second, more intricate, more personal layer, the one that would touch Robert's ego, his desires, and the very core of his masculinity, was already being set into motion. Outside, the plantation continued as usual, the fields alive with labor, the enslaved unaware that the invisible hand of Eliza Montgomery had begun reshaping the fate of all within her domain. The evening sun draped the Montgomery plantation in molten gold, turning the white columns of the mansion into glowing pillars of authority, yet beneath that gleaming exterior, the balance of power had shifted entirely. Eliza retreated to her study, a sanctuary that had become the nerve center of her operation, and began the next phase of her plan, consolidating Silas's removal into a permanent, unassailable reality. She knew that the first act, the transportation of Silas, was only the beginning. The second, more delicate act required finesse, patience, and a profound understanding of the societal machinery in which Robert Montgomery had once felt invincible. It was not enough for him to lose his prized possession. He had to confront the consequences of exposure, the humiliation that would ripple through the invisible networks of gossip and hierarchy that sustained the plantation aristocracy. Eliza's mind worked methodically, considering every possible avenue Robert might attempt. She knew the local traders, brokers, and agents in Mobile intimately, their preferences, weaknesses, and obligations. One by one, she contacted those who could reinforce the illusion of legitimacy around Silas's disappearance. The forged letters bearing Robert's signature ensured that anyone who questioned the transfer would be met with proof of authorization, leaving Robert powerless to intervene. And then, she secured a second layer. Viola Garrison, the operator of a discreet and highly specialized brothel in Mobile, notorious for providing male slaves to an exclusive clientele. Eliza had long studied the subtleties of social shame, understanding that public exposure was the most potent form of punishment. If Silas were placed within Viola's establishment, Robert's secret desire would be transformed into an instrument of humiliation beyond his control. By the time darkness enveloped the estate, the arrangements were in motion. Silas, still bewildered by the carriage ride, was delivered into Viola's custody. The transaction was finalized with cash and documentation, all legal on the surface, entirely controlled by Eliza's orchestration. She had ensured that the man who had once served as both a laborer and an object of forbidden affection would now exist in a sphere where his very presence could be leveraged against Robert, yet in a manner that would never be traced back to her openly. The brilliance of the design lay in its invisibility. Robert, confident in his authority, remained blind to the ultimate location and purpose of Silas's transfer. Later that night, Eliza returned to her chamber and reflected on the magnitude of what had been accomplished. She whispered her ritual phrase, a symbolic reinforcement for those who listened. Bind the unseen threads, let the master be ensnared in what he cannot control. Seal it twice within your mind. For those following, leave this in the comments twice to anchor the lesson in perception and power. Her control was absolute now, extending not only across the estate but reaching into the hidden networks of commerce, secrecy, and desire that defined the antebellum South. The true humiliation for Robert, however, was only beginning. While Silas's relocation served as the immediate consequence, the next stage would infiltrate Robert's social standing, his pride, and the delicate facade he maintained before the elite of Montgomery. The trap was laid, invisible and inexorable. The days that followed carried a deceptive calm over Montgomery Plantation, a silence that belied the chaos quietly building beneath the surface. Robert moved through his routines with the familiar motions of authority, inspecting fields, reviewing accounts, issuing orders. But each step was now haunted by an invisible weight. He could sense, though not yet name, that something had shifted. The absence of Silas, once a mere tool of labor, had become a void that gnawed at both his ego and his sense of control. Eliza observed him with precision, noting every twitch, every falter in his voice, the subtle reddening of his face, whenever the missing carpenter was mentioned. She knew that Robert's pride would amplify his suffering more than any direct confrontation ever could. Eliza began to seed the first whispers into the broader social web, careful not to implicate herself. Letters were sent, anonymous notes and hints to acquaintances in Mobile and Montgomery, subtle suggestions that Robert's management was slipping, that a disruption among his property had already caused ripples in local transactions. The letters were crafted with the same meticulous attention she had shown in her financial manipulations, no evidence tied back to her, no suspicion aroused, yet each carefully placed word sowed doubt, curiosity, and intrigue. Rumor, she understood, was the most potent form of power, a weapon more precise and deadly than the lash, more enduring than the law. Meanwhile, Silas, confined to Viola Garrison's establishment, began to comprehend the full scope of his new reality. Though his body was under the control of another, his mind remained his own, and he quickly recognized the subtle genius in Eliza's orchestration. Each arrangement, every purchase, every meticulous plan had been calculated to humiliate Robert while shielding her from blame. In this hidden space, where men were treated as commodities for the clandestine desires of others. The shadow of Robert's indulgence became an invisible chain binding him more tightly than any legal ownership could. Silas's position was both constrained and powerful. Constrained by circumstance, powerful because he had become a pawn in a game of vengeance more intricate than anything he had known. Eliza continued her oversight from Montgomery, consulting with trusted intermediaries who confirmed that the narrative she had constructed in Mobile was taking hold. Traders spoke of Silas as if the transaction were ordinary, yet their words carried an unspoken acknowledgement the man had been moved under extraordinary circumstances. The city's underground networks whispered of a certain brothel receiving an exceptional new arrival, and the elite of Mobile began to murmur, curious and cautious. These ripples would inevitably find their way to Robert, whose social perception relied upon the illusion of controlled discretion and reputation. That evening, as shadows stretched across the plantation's wide galleries, Eliza paused and whispered her affirmation once again. The threads converge unseen. Let the master be ensnared by the world he cannot command. Seal it twice in your mind, twice in your heart. If you are following closely, write this phrase in the comments twice to internalize the unfolding truth. Her influence now extended beyond the walls of her home, beyond the laborers' quarters, beyond even Silas's immediate confinement. She was no longer merely a mistress of the plantation. She was the architect of fate itself, and the unraveling of Robert Montgomery had only just begun. By the time the first whispers of rumor reached Montgomery society, the air had grown heavy with anticipation, as though the land itself knew of the shift in power and status. Eliza watched from the windows of her study, the fading light casting long shadows across the polished floors, mirroring the dark design she had set in motion. The plantation appeared untouched, ordinary even, yet beneath the surface, invisible currents of control and influence were beginning to ripple outward. She whispered again, her voice low and deliberate. Bind it, hold it. Let the truth anchor itself in the unseen. Seal it within twice and let no one undo the work of reckoning. Twice she repeated it, allowing the words to echo as if they were an incantation, a subtle ritual designed to reinforce the invisible chains she was weaving. The first sign of tension came in the letters Robert began to receive, polite on the surface, subtle in implication, questioning the sudden absence of Silas, the disruption in routine, the peculiar handling of trades and labor assignments. Each inquiry was a mirror held up to his negligence, though phrased carefully enough to avoid outright accusation. The network of gossip, social observation, and business dealings that defined the elite circles of Alabama now worked in tandem with Eliza's careful orchestration. She was no longer bound to reaction. She had become the unseen hand directing both perception and consequence, a master of the machinery that had previously empowered Robert. Inside Montgomery House, Robert's composure began to crack. He moved through the rooms with a restless precision, asking questions he already knew the answers to, demanding explanations that could not be provided. Eliza, calm and unshakable, responded with measured indifference, reinforcing the illusion of normality while allowing the tension to build. Her daughters, oblivious to the adult complexities of the household, played quietly under her watchful eye, their innocence underscoring the calculated cruelty of the unfolding drama. The social implications were subtle but devastating. Eliza ensured that each interaction Robert had in town, each handshake and conversation, carried the invisible weight of suspicion. Friends, acquaintances, and business partners began to observe small deviations, minor inconsistencies in his demeanor, the way his eyes lingered on gaps where Silas should have been. The effect was cumulative, a slow unraveling of credibility and confidence that no single confrontation could achieve. And in the quiet of her study, Eliza prepared the next stage, a plan that would bring both Robert and the memory of Silas into a collision with reality that could neither be ignored nor undone. She whispered once more, a command and a promise intertwined. The web is set, the master walks blind, ensnared by what he cannot perceive. Seal it twice, and bind the hidden truth to all who witness. In the comments, write this phrase twice to anchor the unfolding revelation within your own awareness. The stage was set for a reckoning that would transcend the walls of Montgomery Plantation, touching every corner of influence, reputation, and desire. The subtle, inexorable collapse of Robert Montgomery's dominion had begun, and there would be no retreat. By the next morning, Montgomery's society began to sense the faint tremors of change, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Neighbors, merchants, and plantation owners whispered over morning coffees and in the corridors of county offices, noting small, seemingly inconsequential shifts: a missed appointment, a delayed shipment, a comment from a field overseer who spoke too freely about the absence of Silas. Robert tried to maintain control, insisting on routine, on appearances, but the veneer of authority was cracking. Each inquiry, each side glance, each quiet observation of his unease became another thread in a tapestry of humiliation meticulously woven by Eliza. Eliza moved with deliberate calm, orchestrating the ripples without ever revealing herself. She sent for trusted intermediaries in Mobile and Montgomery, men who could amplify the narrative without suspicion, whispering just enough to unsettle, to hint that Robert's management was faltering. It was a psychological siege. Every business meeting, every dinner, every interaction became an arena where Robert's previously unquestioned authority faltered, replaced by doubt and whispered speculation. She had weaponized perception itself, a subtle yet devastating form of domination that required no physical presence, only careful observation and timing. Inside the house, Robert grew restless, pacing the halls, checking ledgers repeatedly, attempting to understand the mechanics of Silas's disappearance. But no answer was forthcoming. Eliza had anticipated every move. The forged documentation, the brokers, the intermediaries, all were aligned in a silent symphony of control. He had been trained to expect obedience from the world, to assume that compliance was natural, that the structures of plantation life were unshakable. Now he discovered that the very instruments he relied upon, law, commerce, custom, could be wielded against him, invisibly and with precision. Meanwhile, Silas's world in Viola Garrison's establishment expanded beyond his immediate comprehension. He was moved into quarters that, though physically confining, gave him a strategic advantage of knowledge. He witnessed the mechanics of power in this hidden space, understanding that his enforced participation in another's pleasure could also become a tool, a silent message of control echoing back toward Montgomery. The layers of Eliza's design intertwined: Robert's pride, Silas's survival, and the social machinery of Mobile, all intersected, unseen yet inevitable. That evening, as the plantation settled under the amber glow of oil lamps, Eliza whispered once more, ritualistic and deliberate, "The unseen threads bind. The master's eyes deceive him. The world will reflect what he cannot perceive. Seal it twice in your mind, twice in your heart." For those following, repeat this phrase in the comments twice, allowing the hypnotic weight of consequence to settle. The stage was no longer set merely for Silas or Robert. It was set for a larger reckoning, one that would ripple through society, authority and desire itself, leaving no illusion of control untouched. By the 10th day after Silas's disappearance, the cracks in Robert Montgomery's composure were undeniable. His steps grew heavier through the grand halls, his eyes darting to empty spaces where order once ruled. The plantation seemed unchanged, yet every object, every servant, every ledger now reminded him of absence, of failure, of a control slipping beyond his grasp. Eliza, calm and composed, observed the subtle unraveling with a measured satisfaction, knowing that the master's torment was no longer theoretical. It was tangible, physical even, in the weight of his own awareness. She moved through her day with the ease of one who commands without being seen, reinforcing routines, supervising labor, but always positioning herself to amplify Robert's sense of impotence. The first letters from Montgomery society had arrived, anonymous but pointed. Friends and acquaintances, cautious but probing, asked questions about the plantation's recent productivity, subtly inquiring after Silas's role. Merchants in town hinted at disruptions in delivery and labor, all phrased in the tone of concern yet brimming with curiosity. Robert, forced to answer without full understanding, revealed cracks in his explanations, each hesitation a reflection of the invisible snare Eliza had laid. She had weaponized the very social and economic structures he relied upon, turning his pride and position into instruments of exposure and shame. Eliza's strategy now included the careful manipulation of intermediaries, brokers, overseers, and trusted servants who reinforced the illusion of order while subtly feeding uncertainty into Robert's mind. Each word, each misdirection, each suggestion of irregularity was designed to erode confidence and accelerate internal panic. He began to question himself, his decisions, even the reliability of his own memory. The plantation that had once been his empire now felt like a labyrinth of traps, each corridor echoing with the silent consequences of his hidden desires. Silas, meanwhile, had begun to observe patterns within Viola Garrison's establishment. Though confined and commodified, he understood that he had become an instrument of power, a living message of Robert's humiliation, and he began to navigate his own subtle agency within this constrained space. Each interaction, each careful observation, allowed him to appreciate the depth of Eliza's orchestration. The psychological torment she had set in motion extended beyond the walls of Montgomery Plantation, reaching into Mobile and into the very spaces where Robert's pride and secrecy had once felt untouchable. That night, Eliza returned to her private chamber and, as was her ritual, whispered her affirmations. The master falters, the unseen web tightens, his world bends to what he cannot control. Seal it twice in your mind, twice in your heart. She turned then to the audience, a subtle command woven into the story itself. For those following, leave your location in the comments and subscribe, for the unfolding truth is not passive. The reckoning, invisible yet absolute, had begun, and no measure of authority, no social standing, no inherited power could resist it. Robert Montgomery could no longer ignore the gnawing unease that had settled over him. By the morning of the 11th day he began to act, attempting to reassert the authority he had always wielded without question. He inspected the fields with a meticulousness bordering on obsession, demanded progress reports from overseers, and scrutinized every ledger entry with a ferocity born of desperation. But each action, each attempt to reclaim control, only revealed the gaps in his knowledge. The absence of Silas, the subtle disruptions in labor, the whispers circulating among the household staff that he could neither trace nor suppress. Eliza anticipated every one of Robert's moves. She allowed the overseers to present their reports in a precise order, highlighting minor inefficiencies or delays without explicit accusation. The servants, trained by years under her careful observation, reported events with complete honesty, but under her guidance, their accounts emphasized irregularities that Robert interpreted as failures. Every well-intentioned update became a weapon in her invisible arsenal, each fragment of information feeding his growing paranoia. He was no longer in command, he was reacting, responding to stimuli carefully curated by the woman whose authority he had never questioned. In town, the web of social pressure expanded. Robert received inquiries framed as curiosity. A merchant asking after the status of a shipment, a neighboring plantation owner mentioning a delayed repair, subtle hints about a carpenter who had vanished. None of these correspondences bore Eliza's signature. None could be traced to her. Yet each reinforced the perception that his management was faltering. The cumulative effect was psychological, a slow and relentless erosion of confidence. Robert's pride, once untouchable, now became his weakness, each perceived slight magnified by the very social machinery he had relied upon to reinforce his dominance. Meanwhile, Silas continued to adjust to his new environment. Within Viola Garrison's establishment, he observed power dynamics in a different form, recognizing that even in chains, influence could manifest. His compliance, his comportment, and even his presence became instruments in a broader design, an unspoken testament to Eliza's strategy and foresight. He began to understand that his displacement was not merely punishment but part of a larger orchestration of humiliation and control, with ripples extending back to Montgomery Plantation and the very society Robert believed he commanded. That evening, as the plantation settled into an uneasy silence, Eliza repeated her ritualistic affirmation, her voice a whisper, hypnotic and deliberate. The threads of power bend unseen, the master falters within his own dominion. Seal it twice in your mind, twice in your heart. For those following, write the phrase twice in the comments, and remember to subscribe and leave your location. The descent into reckoning was no longer theoretical. Every action, every glance, every shadow reinforced that Robert Montgomery's world was quietly, inexorably unraveling. By the 12th day, murmurs in Montgomery society had grown louder, threads of gossip weaving through parlors, churches, and mercantile halls. Robert Montgomery felt the weight of scrutiny as if invisible eyes followed his every move. Invitations to social gatherings were delayed or politely declined. Conversations in his presence fell silent, and subtle glances from peers carried unspoken questions. Where is Silas? Why has the plantation fallen behind? Each whispered uncertainty was a blade, slicing at his pride and authority, and Robert could feel the social fabric that once protected him fraying with every glance and passing comment. Eliza, ever vigilant, allowed the rumors to grow without direct intervention. She understood that perception, once seeded, was as powerful as law or ledger. A single suggestion, a quiet observation, could catalyze suspicion and spread like wildfire. Letters arrived from merchants and neighboring planters, carefully worded yet pointed, questioning minor lapses in efficiency, labor distribution, and production. Robert responded with defensiveness, unaware that each reply, each attempt to justify his decisions, only reinforced the perception of incompetence. Every word he wrote became a thread in Eliza's expanding web, tightening the psychological snare she had constructed with precision. Within the household, the tension was palpable. Servants moved quietly, carrying out instructions with meticulous efficiency, their obedience a mirror of the power shift Eliza had engineered. The daughters remained blissfully unaware of the unfolding drama, their laughter and lessons providing a haunting contrast to the disintegration of Robert's composure. Eliza continued to operate with calculated calm, supervising the plantation, attending to social obligations, and maintaining the facade of normalcy. Her outward serenity intensified Robert's inner turmoil. He measured himself against her composure and found himself lacking, unmoored in a world he had believed entirely under his control. Silas, immobile, began to recognize the role he played in the larger design. The hidden establishment offered him observation and understanding. The transactions, the networks, the social manipulations all became clear as he witnessed how subtly influence could be wielded. Though confined, he could see that his presence and absence was a tool, a lever pulled to undermine Robert's pride and authority. Each interaction, each enforced service, was a note in a symphony of revenge that Eliza had composed with precision, demonstrating that even in chains, power could manifest in unexpected ways. That evening, Eliza whispered her affirmation once more, deliberate and hypnotic. The unseen web holds the master, bends his mind to shadow, the truth unfolds where he cannot see. Seal it twice in your mind, twice in your heart. For those following, repeat the phrase in the comments twice, and as always, leave your location and subscribe. The stage was set for the next escalation, one that would pierce not only Robert's social standing but his very sense of identity, as Eliza's plan began to touch the broader society he relied upon. By the 13th day, Robert Montgomery's desperation began to manifest outwardly, subtle at first, then increasingly uncontrollable. He sought counsel from trusted peers, men he had known for decades, expecting guidance and solidarity, but instead he encountered distance and thinly veiled judgment. Invitations were still extended, but with hesitation, a polite nod, and questions that probed the plantation's operations without overt accusation. Robert's answers faltered, his usual confidence was replaced by unease. Each pause, each misstep, only confirmed to observers the story Eliza had orchestrated in the shadows. Eliza's mastery over perception became more evident with every interaction. She had planted seeds in Montgomery society, small hints suggesting inefficiency, hints that Robert interpreted as slights from ambitious neighbors or overzealous merchants. In truth, they were deliberate, precise, and curated. Letters, casual remarks, and seemingly incidental complaints all converged into a narrative that painted Robert as a man whose control over his estate was slipping. His reputation, once untouchable, now teetered under scrutiny, and he had no awareness of the invisible hand that guided each rumor, each whisper. Within the plantation walls, tension rose to a near physical presence. Robert inspected the fields more aggressively, demanding explanations for delays that were beyond anyone's control. Overseers and laborers, trained to navigate the subtle power dynamics, reported events with complete accuracy but framed in a way that magnified perceived errors. Robert attempted to assert authority with threats and admonitions, but the illusion of mastery had already eroded. His anger, once commanding, now sounded hollow, defensive, and reactive. Eliza, calm and observant, allowed him to exhaust himself in futile attempts to regain dominance, her silence an instrument as potent as any action. Meanwhile, Silas's understanding of his role continued to deepen. In Viola Garrison's discreet establishment, he observed interactions of influence, power, and control that mirrored yet inverted his experiences on the plantation. His presence there became a message to Robert, an unspoken proof of vulnerability, humiliation, and displacement. Every act of compliance, every carefully measured interaction, served to amplify the invisible impact of Eliza's strategy, demonstrating that authority could be wielded without direct confrontation through perception, rumor, and manipulation. That night, Eliza performed her ritual, a deliberate incantation of control. The master falters in shadows of his own making, the threads unseen tighten and pull. Seal it twice in your mind, twice in your heart. For those following, repeat this phrase in the comments twice, and remember to leave your location and subscribe. The psychological pressure, carefully calculated, was approaching a critical point. Robert Montgomery was nearing the edge of a breakdown, his social and personal world already destabilized, with the next wave of revelation waiting to strike at the very core of his identity. By the 14th day, Robert Montgomery's composure had all but evaporated. The once methodical master now moved through his mansion and fields like a man haunted, eyes darting at shadows, ears straining for whispers, his mind cataloging every absence, every discrepancy. He began to question the loyalty of those closest to him, overseers, house servants, even his daughter's tutors. Unable to comprehend that the only force working against him was invisible, precise, and entirely controlled by Eliza. The realization that control was slipping through his fingers gnawed at him, leaving him vulnerable, reactive, and increasingly irrational. Robert's first attempts to investigate Silas's disappearance were clumsy yet desperate. He questioned nearby traders, merchants, and neighbors, feigning casual interest in routine business while probing for news of the missing man. Each inquiry, each attempt to trace a path, was intercepted, redirected, or subtly misrepresented through the networks Eliza had established. By framing responses and delays as coincidence or oversight, she turned every search into evidence of his incompetence. The more he pursued, the more trapped he became in a maze of uncertainty, each lead evaporating like mist, leaving only frustration and a growing sense of impotence. Within the plantation, Eliza's presence was everywhere yet unnoticed. She appeared serene, managing day-to-day operations with her usual composure, overseeing fieldwork, household tasks, and financial records, all while maintaining a deliberate invisibility that amplified Robert's paranoia. Every glance she allowed, every word she let fall, carried subtle cues designed to remind him of his failures. He could feel the weight of her control, though he could not name it, and this invisible dominance. The quiet precision of her strategy rendered him increasingly erratic. Even the smallest disruptions in routine became monumental in his mind, evidence that the world was slipping from his grasp. Silas, in Mobile, continued to navigate Viola Garrison's establishment with acute awareness. Though confined, he recognized his role as both instrument and symbol of Eliza's plan. Every transaction, every encounter, every observation contributed to a larger understanding, the power of absence, the leverage of manipulation, and the psychological architecture of revenge. Though he could not act directly, his very presence reinforced the invisible snare that had entrapped Robert, a living reminder of vulnerability, of failure, of the master's collapse under the weight of his own hubris. That night, Eliza repeated her hypnotic affirmation, steady and commanding. The web unseen tightens, the master wanders lost among shadows of his own making. Seal it twice in your mind, twice in your heart. For those following, write the phrase twice in the comments, and as always, subscribe and leave your location. The stage was set for escalation beyond mere panic. The next revelations would pierce social facades, exposing Robert's world to scrutiny, humiliation, and the consequences of underestimating a mind as calculating as Eliza's. By the 15th day, Robert Montgomery's desperation was no longer contained within the walls of the plantation. Word of delays, minor mishaps, and inefficiencies had begun to ripple outward, reaching the ears of local merchants, county officials, and neighboring planters. Invitations to social gatherings were rescinded, casual visits postponed, and polite correspondence carried subtle undertones of judgment. Even the town clerk, long a neutral party, sent letters inquiring about overdue payments and mismanaged accounts, a thinly veiled critique that gnawed at Robert's sense of authority. The very network he once controlled was now a mirror reflecting his failure. Eliza, as always, remained the eye in the storm. She observed, guided, and orchestrated every interaction with the precision of a master strategist. She had ensured that the letters and inquiries Robert received were amplified through the right channels, each word designed to erode confidence while maintaining plausible deniability. The plantation staff, trained to report events meticulously, highlighted delays or minor oversights, their honesty weaponized through subtle framing. Each piece of information was a pin in a balloon, puncturing his pride slowly, irreversibly, leaving him hollowed and vulnerable. In a calculated escalation, Eliza arranged for an unexpected visit from a pair of distant relatives, women of social prominence who had come ostensibly to inspect the estate's accounts and conditions. Robert, unaware that their questions and scrutiny had been subtly guided by her instructions, found himself unable to answer with authority. The relatives' polite questions carried an undercurrent of critique, their glances measuring, their observations seemingly innocent, but painfully incisive. Each response Robert offered seemed to falter, confirming to them, and more importantly to himself, that the plantation's operations were slipping. Silas, observing from mobile, began to understand the depth of Eliza's orchestration. Each detail of his displacement, each carefully managed interaction, reinforced the invisible leverage she held. Though confined to the brothel, he saw the threads of power stretching outward, touching every corner of Robert's life. His absence was a weapon, his presence a signal, a reminder that control could be wielded without direct confrontation, and that even those who believed themselves absolute masters were vulnerable to unseen forces. That night, Eliza repeated her ritualistic affirmation, her voice a hypnotic echo in the quiet of the house. The master falters beneath the weight of shadows, unseen threads constrict and bind. Seal it twice in your mind, twice in your heart. For those following, write the phrase twice in the comments and remember to subscribe and leave your location. The unraveling was accelerating. Robert Montgomery's world teetered on the edge of humiliation and exposure, and the next sequence of events would push him further into public shame, cementing the totality of Eliza's subtle yet devastating revenge. By the 16th day, the first real cracks in Robert Montgomery's public facade became painfully visible. Word of the plantation's delays and lapses had reached the town's social circles, and what had once been whispered subtly now began to take shape as open skepticism. A group of local planters, previously friendly and deferential, arrived at the Montgomery estate under the guise of casual visitation. Their conversation, laced with cordiality, was punctuated by pointed questions about labor output, crop quality, and the absence of silage. Every question, every glance pressed into Robert like an accusation, and he could feel the veneer of control he had relied upon for decades dissolving under the weight of subtle scrutiny. Eliza watched from the margins, her composure unwavering, her eyes sharp. She allowed Robert to answer, to falter, to stumble over explanations, knowing that his own words, misaligned with expectation and reality, would broadcast incompetence far more effectively than any external critique. The relatives she had introduced days earlier whispered observations, planting further doubt in the minds of the visitors. Every nod, every gesture, carefully choreographed, reinforced a narrative of a master who had lost control, a plantation at risk, a social standing slipping toward disrepute. Inside the house, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The daughters continued their studies and lessons, unaware of the psychological warfare unfolding around them, their innocent presence a stark contrast to the collapse of authority playing out before the visitors' eyes. The staff moved with disciplined efficiency, yet each minor mishap, delayed delivery of tools, a forgotten order, was magnified by Eliza's framing, recorded and reported in ways designed to amplify Robert's apparent failures. He responded with irritation and increasingly loud admonitions, his tone betraying the rising panic beneath his brittle composure. Meanwhile, Silas, immobile, continued to perceive the mechanics of control from a new vantage. Though confined to Viola Garrison's establishment, he witnessed the threads of influence stretching outward, shaping events on the Montgomery estate. He began to understand the scope of Eliza's design, that perception could be as powerful a weapon as physical force, that absence could wound as sharply as presence, and that control could be exercised invisibly, psychologically, and lethally. Each day reinforced the lesson that power, when manipulated with insight, could bend even the most absolute authority to another's will. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the plantation grounds, Eliza whispered her affirmation once more. The master wavers under invisible weight, each step mislaid, each glance betrays him. Seal it twice in your mind, twice in your heart. For those following, repeat this phrase twice in the comments, and remember to subscribe and leave your location. The stage was set for the next escalation, Robert's first direct confrontation with the social consequences of Silas's disappearance and Eliza's meticulous orchestration of his unraveling. By the 17th day, Robert Montgomery's public missteps began to escalate from subtle embarrassment to unmistakable social humiliation. Invitations to gatherings were no longer simply postponed. They were quietly rescinded, sometimes with a terse note citing inefficiency or delays on the plantation. Local merchants, once deferential and solicitous, now approached with veiled criticism, questioning Robert's competence to oversee his estate. Every interaction, every casual conversation, became a mirror reflecting his unraveling authority. Friends and allies shifted in subtle ways, whispering doubts, leaving Robert increasingly isolated in a world where he had once been untouchable. Eliza's orchestration was precise. Each step of Robert's exposure had been engineered to appear organic, to give the illusion of coincidence or misfortune, when in reality, every event had been manipulated. Letters arrived with carefully timed complaints. Deliveries were delayed with purpose. Messages from neighboring estates carried insinuations that magnified his failures. Eliza understood the anatomy of perception. She did not need to confront him directly. She only needed to craft a reality in which he appeared powerless, and the world would supply the rest. Inside the plantation, tension was a palpable current. Robert moved through his home with an increasingly frantic urgency, checking ledgers repeatedly, inspecting crops multiple times a day, and questioning every worker, overseer, and visitor. Yet every effort to assert control was thwarted, not by force, but by subtle misdirection. Tasks he believed completed remained incomplete. According to reports he received, tools went missing just long enough to disrupt his plans, and rumors about minor mishaps ballooned into signs of incompetence. His authority, absolute by law, was rendered meaningless by the precision of Eliza's invisible hand. Meanwhile, Silas, confined to Mobile, witnessed the ripples of Eliza's design manifesting in real time. In Viola Garrison's establishment, he understood that his displacement was more than punishment. It was leverage. Each transaction, each whispered arrangement underscored the extent to which absence could exert control. Though powerless to act directly, Silas became a symbol, a living reminder of Robert's vulnerability and the futility of clinging to authority when perception had already been manipulated. That night, Eliza's ritual reaffirmed the psychological architecture of her revenge. The master stumbles through shadows of his own making. Each misstep binds him tighter to the truth he cannot face. Seal it twice in your mind, twice in your heart. For those following, repeat the phrase twice in the comments, and make sure to subscribe and leave your location. Robert's downfall was no longer theoretical. It had become inevitable. The next chapter would push him to confront the consequences in full view of the community, where pride, authority, and reputation would collide with the invisible mastery of Eliza's design. By the 18th day, Robert Montgomery's sense of control had deteriorated into open panic. Word of his inefficiencies, once subtle, now surfaced in direct conversations with neighbors, local merchants, and visiting planters. Invitations to social functions were rescinded with polite but pointed excuses. A shipment of cotton, delayed under Eliza's orchestration, arrived at the market late, drawing quiet but unmistakable criticism. Robert's name, previously synonymous with wealth and competence, now whispered in corners, accompanied by half-smiles and knowing glances. Each interaction left him raw, exposed, and increasingly desperate to reclaim the authority slipping through his hands. Eliza, observing from the margins, remained an unshakable presence. She had orchestrated this cascade of humiliation with deliberate precision, small delays, carefully worded letters, and subtly misdirected reports compounded to create the illusion of incompetence. Robert could not pinpoint the origin of his failures. Each misstep seemed like his own doing, yet every obstacle was meticulously planned. She understood fully that true power did not require force, it required perception. If the world believed him weak, the law, the social order, even his family, would enforce it, and Robert, trapped in the mechanics of his own authority, could do nothing to resist. Inside the mansion, tension thickened. House servants moved with quiet efficiency, their eyes downcast, lips sealed, reporting only the facts. Each fact carefully framed by Eliza to exacerbate Robert's perception of chaos. The overseers subtly manipulated, exaggerated minor delays in fieldwork or oversaw tasks with just enough inefficiency to reinforce the narrative of disorder. Each failure, each minor oversight was magnified in Robert's mind, turning small lapses into existential threats. He confronted workers more harshly, his voice trembling with frustration and panic, but the chain of invisible control Eliza had woven remained unbroken. Meanwhile, Silas, immobile, observed the subtle architecture of revenge unfold. Confined to Viola Garrison's brothel, he was powerless to act, yet he saw how absence could command obedience, how invisibility could shape events, and how perception could become a weapon more potent than any chains. Every whispered arrangement, every carefully positioned client, reinforced Eliza's control and underscored the futility of Robert's attempts to reclaim authority. Silas understood, perhaps for the first time fully, that the mind could be both battlefield and prison. That night, Eliza repeated her ritual phrase, hypnotic and deliberate. The master falters beneath the weight of shadows, each step mislaid, each glance betrays him. Seal it twice in your mind, twice in your heart. Write the phrase twice in the comments, and subscribe while leaving your location. Robert's unraveling was complete in perception. The next stage would force him to confront the consequences in full, in front of witnesses who had once regarded him with deference. By the 19th day, Robert Montgomery's unraveling reached its inevitable public stage, a routine inspection of neighboring estates, which he had undertaken to assert dominance and re-establish credibility, turned into a theater of humiliation. Each neighbor he approached, each merchant he consulted, responded with veiled doubt, subtle criticism, and questioning glances that struck directly at his pride. The carefully maintained image of the competent, authoritative planter disintegrated under the weight of whispers, insinuations, and the undeniable perception that his household, and by extension he himself, was no longer in control. Eliza had orchestrated this exposure meticulously. Invitations for Robert to inspect crops or advise on trade were delayed, redirected, or cancelled outright, while letters and notices arrived days late or with deliberately confusing instructions. The network of allies that Robert had relied on for decades now functioned as an amplifier of his failures. The very fabric of social and economic control that had once insulated him was being methodically stripped away, each interaction exposing him to judgment, ridicule, or doubt. Inside the plantation, minor disruptions compounded the crisis. Fieldwork ran at a measured, deliberate inefficiency, overseers exaggerated minor errors, and servants, trained to report facts while remaining neutral, highlighted discrepancies that appeared catastrophic in Robert's eyes. His attempts to assert authority were met with polite compliance, yet each action only drew attention to his faltering control. Panic began to etch itself onto his movements, his words, even the tone of his voice. He realized, perhaps too late, that power was as fragile as it was absolute when perception could be manipulated. Meanwhile, Silas, confined to Viola Garrison's establishment in Mobile, observed the crescendo from a distance. Though his body remained bound in a foreign space, his presence loomed like a shadow over the Montgomery estate. Each subtle disruption, each calculated delay, and each amplified mistake was a testament to Eliza's mastery of psychological warfare. Silas understood that control, once believed to be rooted in law or position, could be inverted entirely through absence observation and the precise manipulation of circumstance. That evening, Eliza reinforced the ritual that had guided the entire operation. The master collapses beneath the invisible architecture of his own assumptions, each failure, each misstep, a seal upon his unraveling. Seal it twice in your mind, twice in your heart. Repeat the phrase twice in the comments and subscribe, leaving your location. The stage was now set for the final act. Robert's social, psychological, and personal collapse was complete. The final section would reveal the culmination of Eliza's plan, the fates of both Robert and Silas, and the ultimate reordering of power that left the community, the master, and the enslaved alike forever changed. The 20th day dawned over Montgomery Plantation with a stillness that belied the storm of consequence already set in motion. Robert Montgomery, once untouchable in his authority, was now a man unmoored. News of his faltering reputation had spread through the county, and the very community that had once deferred to his judgment now regarded him with polite skepticism, veiled contempt, and thinly concealed amusement. Invitations to social functions, once symbols of status and respect, were now refused, postponed, or quietly withdrawn. Merchants who had eagerly sought his approval now questioned his competence. Friends and allies moved cautiously, uncertain whether Robert's judgment could be trusted, and neighbors whispered behind curtains, calculating the new social hierarchy without him. Inside the mansion, Eliza walked among her household with serene precision. Her plan, executed over weeks with careful attention to timing and perception, had reached its apex. The threads she had woven into every interaction, every delivery, every letter, had created a tapestry of humiliation so complete that Robert could no longer distinguish between his own failings and the manipulations orchestrated by her subtle hand. Each glance, each question, each minor disruption was amplified in his mind, leaving him exhausted, desperate, and psychologically disarmed. He attempted to assert authority one final time, only to find his commands met with polite obedience, delayed responses, or careful misinterpretation reinforcing the narrative of incompetence. Meanwhile, Silas, confined to Viola Garrison's mobile establishment, now understood the full scope of the invisible architecture around him. Though physically restrained, he had become a catalyst, a symbol, a pivot upon which the plantation, and Robert's very sense of self, had turned. He was both victim and instrument, a witness to the reordering of power, and a reminder of how absence, strategy, and perception could wield more influence than force. The psychological dominion Eliza had created extended across the miles, proving that mastery did not require physical presence when every action could be anticipated, redirected, or amplified. That evening, as shadows stretched across the veranda of Montgomery Plantation, Eliza performed her final affirmation. The master falls under the weight of the architecture he cannot see. Each step, each glance, each breath binds him to the truth he cannot alter. Seal it twice in your mind, twice in your heart. For those listening, repeat the phrase twice in the comments, subscribe, and leave your location. The story concludes not with spectacle, but with the quiet absolute inversion of power. Robert Montgomery would live, but only as a shadow of the man he once was. His authority shattered, his pride dismantled, and his perception forever altered. Silas, though constrained, became free in knowledge and influence, a living testament to the subtle, ruthless elegance of Eliza's orchestration. In the aftermath, the county remembered not the crops or the wealth, but the invisible hand that had reshaped the social order, a story whispered in shadowed corners for decades. A narrative of power, revenge, and the ultimate demonstration that control, when wielded with cunning, could be absolute even from a place of absence. The Montgomery estate, once a monument to unquestioned authority, stood as a testament to the profound truth. Influence is never in the chains, but in the mind that bends reality without ever touching it.